Before she became the most hated Duchess in England, before the scandal that would destroy reputations and shatter hearts, there was a letter. A single piece of cream parchment that would seal the fate of two souls and set in motion events that Victorian society would whisper about for generations. This is that letter. And this is where our story truly begins. Hartwell House, Mayfair, London, September 1869. My dearest, most beloved Seraphina. I pen these words in the small hours when only truth remains. The candle burns low, casting shadows that dance like ghosts of all I have left unspoken. I have begun this letter 17 times, each attempt too cold, too formal, too insufficient to contain what burns within my chest whenever I speak your name. 6 months have passed since Lake Como. 183 days, precisely, for I have counted every sunrise that has dawned without you. I granted you the time you requested, though each moment has been exquisite agony. I wake reaching for you. I speak to empty chairs. The gardens we walk together have become monuments to longing, and I cannot bear to visit them, for the memory of your laughter among the lemon trees breaks something vital inside me. I am a duke, trained since childhood to value duty over desire, propriety over passion. But you, my darling Seraphina, have rendered all such training obsolete. I do not want a bride selected from Debrett's peerage like one might choose wallpaper. I do not want some insipid girl whose conversation extends no further than the weather. I want you, brilliant, complicated, mysterious you, with an intensity that borders on madness. I love the way your mind works, sharp as winter stars, questioning everything. I love the quiet strength in your bearing, the dignity you maintain despite sorrows I sense but do not yet know. I love the woman who quotes Wordsworth with tears glistening in her eyes. I love the shadows you carry, even as I long desperately to chase them away. I love you not despite your mysteries, but because of them, for they promise depths I am desperate to explore. Come to London, my heart. Come and let me court you properly. I have secured lodgings at the Pemberton residence in Bloomsbury, where my sister Margaret awaits to serve as companion and ensure no whisper of scandal touches you. Everything is prepared, wanting only your presence to make my life complete. I am asking you to marry me, Seraphina. Not someday in some distant future, but now, as soon as propriety allows. Become my Duchess, my partner, the woman whose hand I hold through all the remaining mornings of my life. Trust me with your heart, even as I place mine entirely in your keeping. Perhaps you think yourself unsuited to such a position. Perhaps you believe the disparity in our stations insurmountable. But I am asking you to see what I see, not a woman defined by circumstances of birth, but someone extraordinary, precious beyond measure, worthy of every privilege my position can provide. Say yes, my beloved. Say you will come. Say you will let me love you completely, eternally, without reservation or regret. I await your answer as a condemned man awaits reprieve. Forever and entirely yours, Robert. These were the words of Robert Grenville, 7th Duke of Hartwell, heir to one of England's oldest and most powerful families, a man who commanded wealth beyond measure and influence that stretched to the very halls of Parliament itself. But this letter, these passionate, desperate words, would set in motion a scandal that would shake Victorian society to its foundations. For the woman who received this letter was not who she claimed to be. And the love story that began beside an Italian lake would end in betrayal, public humiliation, and a hatred so fierce that history would remember her as the most despised Duchess England ever knew. This is her story. This is the truth behind the scandal. And it begins not with the letter, but with the lie. She held the letter against her heart, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down like stones. He was offering her everything, love, security, a future beyond her wildest dreams. But accepting meant perpetuating the lie that had begun with a stolen invitation. It meant building happiness on foundations of deception. Still, no one had ever looked at her the way he did, as though she mattered, as though she were precious. Perhaps love was worth the risk. Perhaps some lies were justified by the beauty they protected. She reached for her pen, her hand trembling, and began to write the response that would change both their lives forever. She did not know that this choice would lead her to become the most hated woman in England. She knew only that her heart had already answered yes. The rain fell upon her shoulders like 1,000 accusations as Seraphina Aldridge, Duchess of Hartwell, stood before the iron gates of her own estate whilst a crowd of common folk hurled rotten vegetables and venomous words at her carriage. The mud upon her emerald travelling gown spread like shame itself, dark and irreversible, whilst her gloved hands trembled against the window glass. She could see their faces, twisted with hatred so pure it seemed almost religious in its fervour. They called her thief, they called her liar, they called her the foreign witch who had bewitched their beloved duke. But what wounded her most deeply was the silence from within Hartwell Manor, where her husband remained invisible behind velvet curtains, offering neither defense nor acknowledgement of the woman who bore his name and ring. Welcome to the Duke's shadow, where forbidden love and scandalous secrets collide in the grandest halls of Victorian England. Tell us, dear viewers, from which corner of the world do you witness this tale of heartbreak and redemption? Drop your location in the comments below. Do not forget to press that subscribe button for more absolutely mind-blowing Victorian romance stories that shall leave you breathless. Now, let us return to our unfortunate Duchess in her darkest hour. The gatekeeper would not meet her eyes when he finally approached, his weathered face turned downward as though viewing something distasteful upon the ground. "Your Grace," he muttered, the title sitting uncomfortably upon his tongue, "His Grace the Duke requests that you take residence in the East Wing until such matters are properly resolved." Seraphina felt the words pierce through her corset, through skin, through the very architecture of her ribs. The East Wing, where servants dwelt, where forgotten furniture gathered dust, where wives were sent to disappear from inconvenient view. She had traveled from the glittering ballrooms of Paris to the sunlit piazzas of Rome as nobody, as Mrs. Nobody, invisible and free. Now she possessed a title, a coronet, a place in Debrett's peerage, and she had never been more utterly erased. She descended from the carriage without assistance, her kid boots sinking into mud that the groundskeeper had neglected to clear. The crowd's jeering intensified as she walked, each step a public execution of dignity. Someone threw an egg that exploded against her back, the yolk sliding down imported French silk like a grotesque baptism. Seraphina did not turn, did not flinch, though every muscle in her body screamed for her to run. She thought of the girl she had been 5 years ago, Sarah Blackwood, penniless orphan, sleeping in Venetian doorways with newspaper for blankets. That girl had survived with nothing. Surely this woman, draped in pearls and propriety, could survive with everything turned to poison. She reached the servants' entrance as the first tear escaped, hot and shameful, cutting through the cold that had settled into her bones. Inside the dim corridor, she encountered young Mary, the scullery maid, who gasped and curtsied so low she nearly toppled. "Oh, Your Grace, we did not, that is, we were not informed." The girl's distress was genuine, her hands still coated in flour from the kitchens. Seraphina touched the child's shoulder gently, as she once had done to her own younger sister before fever took her. "Do not trouble yourself, Mary. I require only a basin of water and solitude." The maid fled, leaving Seraphina alone in the corridor where she could hear the distant sounds of the household continuing without pause, without acknowledgement. Somewhere above, in the grand apartments, her husband was likely taking his afternoon brandy, surrounded by men who whispered that his foreign bride had brought nothing but scandal and ruin. They did not know, could not know, the truth that burned inside her like swallowed coals. She climbed the narrow stairs to the East Wing, each step creaking beneath her weight as though the house itself judged her unworthy. The room they had prepared was barely larger than the wardrobe in her former chambers. A single window overlooked the kitchen gardens, where even now she could see the head gardener directing his men to cut the roses she had personally selected last spring. They were removing every trace of her, methodically, cruelly. Seraphina sank onto the hard mattress and finally allowed herself to remember how this nightmare began. Not with her arrival at Hartwell, not with her wedding to the Duke, but earlier, much earlier, when she was just a girl with a forged calling card and a desperate dream, stepping off a train in Paris with 3 shillings in her pocket and terror singing in her veins. If she was to survive this fresh hell, she needed to remember who she had been when she had nothing to lose. 7 years earlier, Seraphina Blackwood stood on the Dover docks with a carpet-bag that contained everything she owned in the world: 2 faded dresses, her mother's silver locket, a stolen ladies' magazine, and a determination so fierce it frightened even herself. The wind off the channel tasted of salt and possibility, carrying with it the promise of escape from the London slums where her father's debts had multiplied like rats in darkness. She was 19, penniless, and utterly alone, her mother dead these 6 years, her father vanished into debtor's prison, and her younger sister Eleanor buried beneath a pauper stone she could not afford to mark. The crossing to Calais cost her last £2, and when the captain's mate leered at her with suggestions of alternative payment, she had struck him with her carpet-bag hard enough to leave a bruise. Some degradations, she had decided, were not worth survival. Paris struck her like a symphony composed entirely of overwhelming sensations. The crowds moved differently than in London, slower, more deliberate, as though the French possessed some secret knowledge about extracting pleasure from mere existence. The buildings rose in cream and gold, their windows glittering with a prosperity that made her throat ache with longing. She had read about this city in the magazine she had stolen from the drawing room where she had briefly worked as a maid, before the master's son had cornered her in the pantry and she had been forced to defend her virtue with a soup ladle and her immediate employment. The article had described Paris as a place where a clever woman might reinvent herself entirely, where the rigid English class distinctions dissolved into something more fluid and forgiving. But standing in the Gare du Nord with no French and no prospects, Seraphina wondered if she had simply chosen a more elegant location in which to starve. She found work within a week, but it was not the glamorous position she had imagined. Madame Dubois ran a small boarding house near the Marais where the rooms smelled of cabbage and disappointment, and she needed someone to scrub floors for a few francs and a pallet in the attic. Seraphina accepted without negotiation, grateful merely to have a roof and one meal daily. But in the evenings, she would slip out to walk the boulevards, pressing her face to the windows of cafes where elegant women in silk laughed behind gloved hands while gentlemen in perfectly tailored coats debated philosophy and art. She studied them like an actress learning lines, the way they held their teacups, the slight elevation of the chin that signaled breeding, the particular manner in which they dismissed servants with barely a glance. She borrowed books from a sympathetic English bookshop owner and taught herself French by candlelight until her eyes burned. She was not merely surviving. She was preparing for transformation. The moment of opportunity arrived 6 months later in the form of a carelessly discarded invitation. Seraphina had been sent to clean the rooms of Madame Lefevre, a widow who occasionally rented accommodations during her Paris visits. The old woman had departed that morning in a fury after an argument with Madame Dubois about the quality of bed linens, leaving behind a trail of expensive belongings and one cream-colored card edged in gold. It was an invitation to a reception at the British Embassy, addressed to a Mrs. Helena Ashford, a woman Madame Lefevre had mentioned was traveling somewhere in the Italian lakes and would not return for months. Seraphina held the card with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of impossibility and reckless hope. If she appeared at the embassy as Mrs. Ashford, who would question her? Who truly knew every British widow meandering through Europe? The worst consequence would be exposure and humiliation. The best would be entry into a world she had only glimpsed through windows. She pawned her mother's locket, the last piece of her true identity, and purchased a second-hand evening gown from a discreet shop that catered to ladies' maids selling their mistresses' cast-offs. The dress was dark blue silk with only a small wine stain near the hem that she could conceal with careful positioning. She arranged her hair as she had seen in the magazines, pinned up with cheap combs she made look expensive through sheer confidence. On the night of the reception, she walked to the British Embassy with her heart threatening to crack through her ribs. The footman at the door barely glanced at her invitation before waving her through. Just like that, Seraphina Blackwood ceased to exist. In her place stood Mrs. Helena Ashford, a respectable widow traveling Europe for her health. In her place stood Mrs. Nobody, and Mrs. Nobody could become absolutely anyone at all. The British Embassy blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off mirrors and crystal until Seraphina felt she had stepped inside a jewelry box. She moved through the crowd with studied grace, her spine straight, her expression pleasantly neutral, exactly as she had practiced in the tarnished mirror of her attic room. The other guests flowed around her like water around stone, acknowledging her presence with polite nods but asking no probing questions. This was the magic of being Mrs. Nobody. In a society obsessed with titles and connections, a widow of modest means traveling for her health was simultaneously unremarkable and unassailable. No one wished to appear rude by demanding her pedigree, and no one cared enough to investigate. She was simply there, a piece of human furniture among the potted palms and champagne fountains. She learned rapidly that the key to maintaining her fiction was to speak very little and listen constantly. When addressed, she would smile and offer vague pleasantries about the beauty of Paris or the mildness of the weather. When asked about Mr. Ashford's profession, she would lower her eyes in practiced grief and murmur something about trade in the colonies, before changing the subject with a delicate question about the other person's interests. People adored discussing themselves, she discovered. They would fill silences with their own narratives while she nodded and made sympathetic sounds, all the while cataloguing useful information. She learned which hotels offered discreet accommodations for ladies of limited means, which shops would extend credit based on a convincing accent and borrowed confidence, which social events welcomed unattached women without excessive scrutiny. Within 3 months, she had established Mrs. Helena Ashford as a familiar if unremarkable figure in the expatriate British community. Her existence was a tightrope walk above an abyss of exposure, but Seraphina discovered she possessed a talent for this particular performance. She moved from Paris to Geneva, from Geneva to Florence, always staying in modest but respectable accommodations, always appearing at afternoon teas and charity events where her presence required no explanation. She survived through a combination of careful economy and strategic friendships with elderly ladies who appreciated her willingness to read aloud or organize their correspondence. In exchange for these small services, they would pass along gowns they no longer wished to wear, recommend her to other travelers seeking companionship, occasionally press a few coins into her hand with protestations that she really must not work so hard. It was charity disguised as friendship, and Seraphina accepted it with grace that concealed her burning shame. But shame, she had learned, was a luxury she could not afford. In Rome, she encountered Lady Pemberton, an actual widow whose husband had left her a comfortable income and a restless spirit. The old woman took an immediate fancy to Seraphina, declaring that she needed a traveling companion with sense and education rather than some silly young thing obsessed with finding a husband. "You have the quality of someone who has truly suffered, my dear," Lady Pemberton announced over tea in their shared pension. "I find it vastly refreshing. These other women with their performative grief and their strategic widowhood, they tire me beyond expression. But you, Mrs. Ashford, you possess authenticity." The irony of the statement nearly made Seraphina laugh aloud. Here she was, performing the greatest deception of her life, being praised for her authenticity. But Lady Pemberton's friendship proved transformative. With the old woman's endorsement, doors opened that had previously remained locked. Invitations arrived for house parties and country visits throughout Italy and Austria. It was during a summer residence at Lake Como that Seraphina's carefully constructed world first trembled. She was sitting in the garden of Villa Carlotta, reading to Lady Pemberton from a volume of Wordsworth, when a gentleman's voice interrupted with a question posed in perfect English. "Forgive the intrusion, but I could not help overhearing. Are you reading Tintin Abbey? It is a particular favorite of mine." She looked up to find a man of perhaps 35 years, tall and austere in his bearing, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes of such penetrating grey that she felt he could read the truth written across her fraudulent soul. "Indeed, sir," she replied carefully, closing the book. "My companion finds the imagery soothing." He smiled then, and something in that smile made her heart perform an unfamiliar maneuver behind her ribs. "May I introduce myself? I am Hartwell. I am staying at the villa next door and confess to being desperately starved for intelligent English conversation." Lady Pemberton perked up considerably. "Hartwell? Not the Duke of Hartwell?" He inclined his head with obvious discomfort at the title. And Seraphina, who had spent 3 years learning to hide every emotion, felt her mask slip just slightly as she realized she had captured the attention of one of England's most eligible and elusive peers. The Duke of Hartwell was not what Seraphina had imagined when she read about aristocrats in her stolen magazines. He possessed neither the careless arrogance nor the decorative uselessness she associated with titled gentlemen. Instead, he moved through the world with a quiet intensity, as though constantly analyzing some complex equation visible only to himself. Over the following weeks at Lake Como, he became a regular visitor to their villa, ostensibly to discuss literature with Lady Pemberton but increasingly to engage Seraphina in conversations that ranged from philosophy to politics to the proper cultivation of roses. He spoke to her not as an ornamental woman but as an intellectual equal, and this, more than any physical attraction, began to erode the careful walls she had constructed around her heart. She knew this attachment was dangerous. She knew discovery would mean ruin. Yet when he looked at her with those penetrating grey eyes, she found herself wanting to confess everything. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashford," he said one afternoon as they walked the villa gardens while Lady Pemberton napped, "do you never tire of this wandering existence? Do you not long for a home, for permanence?" His question caught her unprepared, and for a moment, the truth nearly spilled from her lips, that she had never possessed a true home, that permanence was a luxury for people whose existence was not built on lies, that she was so exhausted from performing that sometimes she forgot which version of herself was genuine. But instead, she smiled with practiced serenity and replied, "I find that rootlessness has its own peculiar freedom, Your Grace. When one belongs nowhere, one can be comfortable anywhere." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his expression troubled. "I confess I have been thinking about you far more than is appropriate for a gentleman in my position. There is something in you, some quality I cannot name, that suggests hidden depths and unspoken sorrows. I find myself wanting to know all your secrets, Mrs. Ashford, though I suspect you guard them very carefully indeed." Her pulse accelerated dangerously. "Your Grace, I am certain you are merely experiencing the romantic delusions that Italian lakes inspire in even the most sensible persons. Next week you shall return to England and forget entirely that you once conversed with a wandering widow beneath lemon trees." But he shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I do not think I shall forget you at all. In fact, I believe I am developing a most inconvenient attachment. You see, Mrs. Ashford, I am meant to marry. My family has been pressuring me for years to select a suitable bride from among the eligible daughters of my social equals. But I find myself entirely uninterested in their accomplishments and breeding. I want conversation. I want intelligence. I want someone who has lived enough to understand that privilege is both gift and burden. I want, forgive my boldness, I want you. The declaration hung between them like something physical, impossible to ignore or unsee. Seraphina felt panic and longing war within her chest. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to disappear, to protect her fragile construction from this man's dangerous regard. You know nothing about me, she whispered, and it was perhaps the truest thing she had ever said to him. You are enamored with a phantom, Your Grace. The woman you perceive does not exist. He reached for her hand then, a shocking breach of propriety that sent electricity through her glove. Then tell me who you are. Strip away the formalities and pretenses. I promise you, Mrs. Ashford, whatever you reveal shall not diminish my regard. But this was precisely what she could not do. To reveal herself as Seraphina Blackwood, penniless orphan and professional impostor, would be to lose not only his regard but potentially her freedom. There were laws against the kind of deception she had practiced. She gently withdrew her hand and stepped back, re-establishing the safe distance between them. Some mysteries, Your Grace, are best left unsolved. I am no suitable bride for a duke. I have no family, no fortune, no connections that would benefit your position. Your attachment, however flattering, is built upon sand. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, not retreat, but rather determination crystallizing into resolve. I have spent my entire life doing what was expected, marrying whom was appropriate, maintaining standards that served everyone but myself. I am 37 years old, Mrs. Ashford, and I have never once chosen something simply because it made my heart lift in my chest. Until now. I am asking you to give me the opportunity to know you, truly know you, without the barriers of title and expectation. Come to England. Not immediately, not in any way that would compromise your reputation. But come. Allow me to court you properly, to demonstrate that my interest is neither whim nor delusion. Seraphina felt herself standing at a precipice, with two equally terrifying choices before her: return to her wandering half-life as Mrs. Nobody, forever safe and forever empty, or accept his invitation and risk everything on the possibility that love might somehow transcend the lies upon which their connection was built. She thought of the girl she had been, sleeping in doorways, stealing bread. That girl had risked everything on far more foolish chances. I shall consider your proposal, Your Grace, she said quietly. And in that moment, she sealed both their fates. Seraphina arrived in London 6 months later on a grey November morning that matched the turbulence in her soul. She had written to the Duke only once, a carefully worded letter explaining that she needed time to settle certain affairs before accepting any courtship. In truth, she had spent those months attempting to construct a more substantial foundation for her fictional identity. She had traveled to a small village in Kent where records were poorly maintained and convinced a sympathetic vicar that she needed documentation of her late husband's burial after the original papers were lost in a fire. With a few well-placed tears and a generous donation to the church poor box, she secured a certificate that gave Mr. Helena Ashford the substance of recorded death. She hated the necessity of this deception, hated the accumulating weight of lies, but retreat was no longer possible. She had tasted the possibility of genuine connection, and the hunger for it had become almost unbearable. The Duke had secured lodgings for her at a respectable ladies' residential hotel in Bloomsbury, carefully selected to protect her reputation while allowing him opportunities for proper courtship. He called upon her the very afternoon of her arrival, his face illuminating with such unguarded joy when she entered the sitting room that Seraphina felt shame and longing twist together like poison and honey. You came, he said simply, as though her presence constituted some miraculous occurrence. I confess I feared you would remain in Italy forever, a beautiful ghost I had imagined into being. She managed to smile despite the anxiety clawing at her throat. Your Grace, I have learned that one cannot hide from fate indefinitely. Sometimes one must simply walk forward and accept whatever consequences await. He took her hands in both of his own, propriety momentarily forgotten. I intend to ensure the only consequence you face is happiness, Mrs. Ashford. I promise you that. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Seraphina had imagined. The Duke, she could not bring herself to call him by his Christian name, Robert, despite his repeated requests, conducted their romance with meticulous regard for her comfort and reputation. They took chaperoned walks in Hyde Park, attended theatre performances with his sister Lady Margaret as companion, engaged in lengthy conversations about everything from agricultural reform to the poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He introduced her to his closest friends with a possessive pride that both thrilled and terrified her. She watched him carefully for signs that he suspected her deception, but found only growing affection and respect. He treated her as though she were precious crystal, something to be protected and cherished. The guilt became almost physical, a constant ache behind her ribs that no amount of rationalization could ease. She told herself that she had not changed in essence, that the woman he loved was real, even if her name and history were fabricated. But late at night, alone in her rented room, she knew this distinction was merely another lie she told to enable sleep. His formal proposal came on a spring evening in the Hartwell London residence, a magnificent townhouse in Mayfair that made her childhood poverty seem like something from another lifetime entirely. He had arranged a private dinner, just the two of them with servants dismissed, and afterward, he had led her to the conservatory where orchids bloomed in impossible profusion. Seraphina, he said, using her Christian name for the first time. She had told him it was Helena, but he had somehow intuited the truth of her preferred name, though not the fuller truth beneath. I have lived my life in service to duty and expectation. My title, my estates, my very existence has been dictated by the requirements of my position. But you have shown me that there is more to life than mere fulfillment of obligation. You have taught me that the heart has requirements that supersede pedigree and politics. I am asking you to be my wife, not because it is appropriate or expected, but because I cannot imagine constructing a life in which you are not the central pillar of my happiness. She should have confessed everything in that moment. The words trembled on her tongue. I am not who you believe, I have deceived you from our first meeting, I am penniless and baseborn and everything your world despises. But before she could speak, he continued, I know you have reservations. I know you consider yourself beneath my station, though I find such distinctions increasingly meaningless. I know you guard some pain from your past that you have not shared with me. I am asking you to trust me with those burdens, Seraphina. I am asking you to believe that whatever you reveal shall only deepen my commitment to your protection and happiness. His words were so sincere, his expression so open, that something broke inside her carefully maintained defenses. She found herself nodding, accepting, saying yes to the Duke of Hartwell while the lies and truth tangled so completely within her that she could no longer distinguish one from the other. He kissed her then, gently, reverently, as though sealing a sacred covenant. And Seraphina Blackwood, orphan and impostor, stepped across the threshold into a future she had stolen through deception and would now have to maintain through increasingly elaborate performance. The wedding was set for 8 weeks hence, and with each passing day, the weight of her secrets grew heavier, more suffocating, more impossible to bear. The wedding ceremony took place in the private chapel at Hartwell Manor, a Gothic structure of grey stone and stained glass that seemed designed to make Seraphina feel her unworthiness in every architectural detail. She wore ivory silk that had cost more than she had earned in her entire previous life, and as she walked down the aisle without father or family to give her away, she felt the curious eyes of the Duke's relatives burning into her like brands. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, sat in the front pew with an expression that was not disgust, as Seraphina had expected, but something far more troubling, profound grief barely contained behind a mask of aristocratic composure. His sister Lady Margaret smiled encouragingly, but even that kindness felt weighted with a sorrow Seraphina did not yet understand. The aristocratic assembly had made their feelings clear in the weeks preceding the wedding. The Duke was marrying beneath himself, attaching his ancient lineage to a woman of no consequence, no connections, no discernible value beyond a pleasing face and questionable circumstances. Robert looked at her as though she were something miraculous as she reached the altar. The vicar's words washed over her in a blur of sacred promises she had no right to make. When she spoke her vows, using the false name Helena that had become both prison and protection, her voice emerged steadier than she had anticipated. She became the Duchess of Hartwell in a ceremony that lasted less than an hour but changed the fundamental architecture of her existence forever. The wedding breakfast afterward was an ordeal of forced civility, with guests offering congratulations that barely masked their judgment. But it was what happened after most guests had departed that revealed the truth Seraphina had not known she was walking into. The Dowager Duchess approached her near the champagne fountain, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with emotion that had nothing to do with snobbery. You must understand something, Mrs. Ashford. You are not the first woman to become Duchess of Hartwell. My son was married before, to Arabella. She was everything your world values, impeccable breeding, substantial fortune, connections that stretched to the royal family itself. Seraphina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Robert had never mentioned a previous wife. Never once in all their conversations had he hinted at this history. The dowager continued, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Arabella died 3 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained. She fell from the North Tower during a house party, and although it was ruled an accident, there were whispers. Whispers that she had been unhappy, that the marriage had been arranged rather than chosen, that she had confided to friends about feeling trapped in a life she never wanted. I loved my daughter-in-law, Mrs. Ashford. I watched her fade and diminish under the weight of expectations she could not meet. And when she died, I promised myself I would never allow my son to enter another marriage built on anything less than absolute truth and genuine affection. So I ask you now, with all the honesty you can muster, do you truly love my son, or are you simply another woman seeking elevation through matrimonial convenience? The question hung between them like a blade, and Seraphina understood suddenly that the dowager's opposition was not born of snobbery but of protective terror. This woman had lost one daughter-in-law to the crushing machinery of aristocratic expectation, and she feared history repeating itself. Seraphina met the older woman's gaze directly and spoke with the only complete truth she possessed. Your Grace, I love your son with every fiber of my being. That, at least, is no deception. Whatever else I may be, whatever secrets I may carry, my feelings for Robert are the most genuine thing about me. The dowager studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then I hope for both your sakes that love proves sufficient to sustain you through whatever storms approach. Because they are coming, my dear. I can feel them gathering on the horizon like thunderheads before a tempest. That night, in the honeymoon suite that had been prepared for them, Seraphina finally gathered the courage to ask Robert about his first marriage. His expression darkened immediately, pain and guilt warring across his features. I should have told you, he said quietly, turning away to stare out the window at the moonlit gardens. Arabella was chosen for me by my family when I was 22 years old. I did not love her, and she did not love me, but we both understood our duty. We were civil to each other, respectful even, but there was no passion, no genuine connection. She fulfilled her obligations perfectly, managed the household, appeared at my side for social functions, never complained about the emptiness of our existence together. But I saw how it destroyed her, piece by piece, year by year. The bright, laughing girl I married became a ghost who drifted through these rooms like she was already dead. He turned back to face Seraphina, his eyes haunted by memories she could not share. The night she died, we had quarreled. Not violently, we were too well-bred for that, but with the cold precision of two people who have stopped pretending to care. She told me she felt like she was suffocating, that she had been performing the role of Duchess for so long she had forgotten who she truly was beneath the costume. I told her, God forgive me, I told her that we all must play the roles assigned to us, that personal happiness was a luxury our positions could not afford. She walked away from that conversation and went to the North Tower. Whether she fell accidentally or whether she chose to fall, I shall never know. But I know with absolute certainty that I helped kill her through my coldness and my refusal to acknowledge that duty without love is merely slow death dressed in silken titles. Seraphina crossed the room and took his hands in hers, feeling the trembling that ran through his strong frame. Robert, I am not Arabella. I chose you freely, knowing exactly what this life entails. I will not fade or diminish, I promise you that. But even as she spoke the words, she felt their hollowness. She was not Arabella, true, but she was building their marriage on lies just as surely as his first had been built on loveless duty. And somewhere in the darkened corners of her mind, a voice whispered that perhaps the dowager was right, perhaps storms were indeed gathering, and when they arrived, love alone might not prove sufficient shelter against the devastation they would bring. The first 6 months of marriage passed in a blur of carefully managed performances. Seraphina threw herself into the role of Duchess with desperate determination, working alongside the housekeeper to modernize the servants' quarters, establishing a school for the children of tenant farmers, organizing charity events that raised substantial funds for London's poor. She needed to prove, to the dowager, to herself, to the watching eyes of society, that she was more than a fortune hunter, that she deserved the position she had stolen through deception. The household staff, initially skeptical, gradually warmed to her genuine efforts. Even the formidable Mrs. Blackwood, whose name still made Seraphina's stomach clench every time she heard it, began to soften after Seraphina personally nursed her through a bout of influenza. Robert watched these efforts with visible pride, often remarking to his sister Margaret that he had chosen better than he knew. But everything changed on a crisp October evening when the Hartwell family hosted their annual autumn ball. The great hall blazed with candlelight, and guests from across England's highest ranks filled the rooms with laughter and music. Seraphina wore emerald silk that complemented her dark hair, and for the first time since arriving at Hartwell, she felt almost comfortable in her role. She was dancing with Robert, his hand warm against her waist, when she saw the woman across the ballroom. Time seemed to stop. The music faded to distant noise. Because standing near the refreshment table, wearing an expression of dawning recognition and unmistakable shock, was Madame Du Bois, the boarding house keeper from Paris who had employed Seraphina as a scullery maid 7 years ago. Seraphina's feet stumbled, and only Robert's quick reflexes prevented her from falling. "My dear, are you unwell?" he asked with immediate concern. She forced herself to breathe, to smile, to lie. "Merely dizzy from the heat, Your Grace. Perhaps some air?" He led her toward the terrace doors, but before they could escape, a voice cut through the crowd with the precision of a blade. "Mrs. Ashford. Or should I say, Mademoiselle Blackwood? Mon Dieu, I cannot believe my eyes." Madame Du Bois was pushing through the dancers, her face flushed with wine and the malicious excitement of scandal about to erupt. "You remember me, surely? Madame Du Bois, from the boarding house in the Marais? You scrubbed my floors for 6 months before you disappeared with that stolen invitation." The ballroom fell silent with the abruptness of a guillotine blade dropping. Every eye turned toward Seraphina, watching, waiting, judging. She felt Robert's hand tighten on her arm, felt the weight of 100 aristocratic gazes pressing down like physical force. Madame Du Bois continued, oblivious to or perhaps reveling in the destruction she was causing, "I always wondered what became of you. And here you are, dressed as a duchess. Oh, this is too extraordinary. You must tell me how you managed such a magnificent deception. From scullery maid to the mistress of Hartwell, truly, it is the stuff of novels." The French woman laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the terrible silence. Seraphina stood frozen, every carefully constructed defense crumbling around her like castle walls under siege. She could feel Robert beside her, could sense rather than see the confusion and dawning horror in his expression. The Dowager Duchess materialized from the crowd, her face pale but composed, already moving into damage control. "Madam," she said with icy precision, "I believe you are suffering from some confusion. Perhaps the champagne has been too generous this evening? Henderson, please see that this lady is escorted to a guest room where she might rest." But Madame Du Bois was not so easily silenced. She pulled from her reticule a small carte de visite, yellowed with age, and held it aloft triumphantly. "No confusion, Your Grace. I have here a photograph of my boarding house staff from 1862. And there, you can see for yourself, is Mademoiselle Seraphina Blackwood, wearing a maid's uniform and standing beside my coal bin." Robert took the photograph with hands that trembled slightly. Seraphina watched his face as he studied the image, watched the exact moment when he recognized the young woman in servant's clothing as the wife standing beside him. His expression did not change dramatically, he was too well trained for such displays, but something died in his eyes, some light extinguishing with a finality that broke her heart. "Everyone, please," Lady Margaret's voice cut through the gathering storm, "I am certain there is a reasonable explanation. Perhaps we might continue with the dancing while this matter is privately resolved." But the damage was done. The whispers had already begun, spreading through the ballroom like wildfire through dry timber. Seraphina, Duchess of Hartwell, had been exposed as Seraphina Blackwood, penniless scullery maid and systematic fraud. Robert turned to her, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, meant only for her ears. "Is it true? All of it?" She wanted to deny it, to fabricate some explanation that would preserve the illusion a few moments longer. But standing in that ballroom with 100 witnesses to her exposure, surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed lies, she found she could no longer summon the energy for deception. "Yes," she said simply. "Every word is true. I am Seraphina Blackwood. I was a scullery maid in Paris. I stole the invitation to the British Embassy. I created the fiction of Mrs. Helena Ashford. I deceived you from the first moment we met. I am exactly what she says, a fraud, an impostor, a nobody who dared to reach above her station." The confession emerged with the flat quality of absolute defeat, and as she spoke the words, she watched Robert's face close like a door slamming shut, sealing her out forever from whatever genuine connection they had shared. The guests departed within the hour, their hurried exits barely disguised by polite excuses about early morning commitments and sudden illnesses. Madame Du Bois, realizing too late the magnitude of destruction she had caused, attempted to apologize, claiming she had meant no harm and had merely been surprised to encounter a former servant in such elevated circumstances. The Dowager had her bodily removed from the premises with instructions that she was never to set foot on Hartwell land again. But the damage was irreversible. By morning, every drawing room in London would be buzzing with the scandal. The Duke of Hartwell had been systematically deceived and entrapped by a penniless scullery maid masquerading as a respectable widow. The newspapers would feast on this for months. Robert did not speak to Seraphina again that night. He simply walked away from her in the middle of the emptying ballroom, his shoulders rigid with suppressed emotion, and disappeared into his private study. She stood alone among the wilting flower arrangements and guttering candles, watching servants begin the process of cleaning up the debris of celebration turned catastrophe. Lady Margaret approached cautiously, her kind face creased with distress. "Seraphina, you should retire to your chambers. I shall speak with Robert once he has had time to process this shock. Perhaps in the morning, when emotions are less raw, we can find some path forward." But Seraphina knew there was no path forward, no redemption possible from this particular fall. She had committed the unforgivable sin in aristocratic society, not poverty, not even prostitution, but deception of a peer. She had made a duke look foolish, had exposed him to ridicule and pity. That was a transgression for which society offered no forgiveness. She went to her chambers and dismissed her lady's maid, unable to bear the girl's pitying looks and whispered sympathies. Alone, she began the methodical process of removing the emerald silk gown, the pearl necklace Robert had given her on their wedding day, the diamond earrings that marked her as Duchess. She stood in her chemise, staring at her reflection in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman looking back. When had she stopped being Sarah Blackwood, the survivor who had clawed her way up from nothing? When had she become this fragile creature whose entire existence depended on maintaining an increasingly complex web of lies? She thought of her sister Eleanor, dead at 14 from a fever they could not afford to treat. Eleanor, who had never pretended to be anything other than what she was, who had died with dignity intact. Seraphina had survived, yes, but at what cost? She had traded her authentic self for borrowed finery and a title built on sand. A knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She expected Lady Margaret or perhaps the housekeeper with some practical concern about the household. Instead, when she opened the door, she found the Dowager Duchess standing in the corridor, still dressed in her evening finery, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked remarkably like sympathy. "May I come in?" the older woman asked. Seraphina stepped back wordlessly, allowing her entry. They stood facing each other in the lamplight, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, the Dowager said, "I suspected, you know. Not the specific details, but I knew you were hiding something significant. The way you moved through society, too careful, too studied, like an actress playing a role she had memorized but not fully internalized. I hired investigators months ago." Seraphina felt what little remained of her composure crumble. "Then why did you not expose me sooner? Why allow the wedding to proceed if you knew I was deceiving your son?" The Dowager walked to the window, gazing out at the darkened gardens. "Because I watched you with him, and I saw something I had never seen in his first marriage, genuine affection. You looked at Robert as though he were precious to you, not for his title or fortune, but for himself. And he looked at you the same way. After Arabella's death, I swore I would never prioritize pedigree and propriety over my son's happiness again. So I held my tongue, hoping that perhaps love might prove more important than bloodlines. I was wrong, it seems. Or perhaps I was right about the love but underestimated society's capacity for cruelty." She turned back to face Seraphina, and in her eyes was a complexity of emotion that defied simple categorization. "My investigators uncovered most of your history, the poverty, your father's debts, your sister's death, the boarding house in Paris. What they also uncovered was every charitable act you have performed since arriving at Hartwell. The school you established feeds and educates 40 children who would otherwise have nothing. The reforms you implemented have improved the lives of every tenant family on our estates. The servants speak of you with genuine affection, something they never did for Arabella despite her perfect breeding. You have been a better Duchess in 6 months than many women born to the role manage in decades. Does that not count for something?" Seraphina felt tears burning in her eyes but refused to let them fall. "It counts for nothing if it is all built on lies, Your Grace. I have made your son a laughingstock. I have brought scandal upon your family name. Whatever good I may have done is eclipsed entirely by the fundamental dishonesty of my presence here. I should never have come to London. I should never have accepted Robert's courtship. I should have remained Mrs. Nobody, invisible and harmless, rather than reaching for something that was never meant for someone like me." The Dowager crossed the room and did something entirely unexpected. She took Seraphina's hands in her own, her grip firm and warm. "My dear girl, do you think you are the only woman in this room who has had to perform a role that did not quite fit? Do you think aristocratic birth protects us from the necessity of becoming whoever our positions require us to be? I was married at 17 to a man 40 years my senior who I had met precisely twice before our wedding day. I spent 30 years playing the perfect Duchess while dying inside bit by bit. The only difference between us is that you chose your cage while mine was assigned at birth. The words struck Seraphina with unexpected force, revealing depths of understanding she had not imagined possible from this formidable woman. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The dowager released her hands and straightened, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had arrived. Now we face the consequences. The scandal will be catastrophic. Robert's political allies will distance themselves. Society will ostracize you both. There will be calls for annulment, possibly even criminal prosecution for fraud. I have already sent word to our solicitors to begin preparing legal defenses. But Seraphina, there is one thing you must understand. Whether my son chooses to stand by you or set you aside is entirely his decision to make. I will not interfere. I have done enough interfering in his romantic life to last several lifetimes. Whatever he decides, I will support him. But know this, if he asks you to leave, you will not be cast out penniless. I will ensure you have sufficient funds to establish yourself somewhere quietly, to live with dignity even if you cannot keep the title. Seraphina wanted to refuse the offer, to maintain some shred of pride by declining charity. But she had been poor before, and she knew exactly how quickly pride evaporated when faced with genuine hunger and homelessness. Thank you, Your Grace. Your kindness is more than I deserve. The dowager moved toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. Seraphina, may I offer you one piece of advice from one woman who has survived impossible situations to another? Do not make Robert's decision for him by running away before he has had the chance to make it. Give him the opportunity to surprise you. Men are capable of far more grace than we generally credit them with, and my son, for all his faults, possesses a capacity for forgiveness that I have watched him extend to far less worthy recipients than yourself. Wait. Let him come to his own conclusions. Whatever happens, at least you will know you faced the consequences rather than fleeing from them. She slipped out, leaving Seraphina alone with her thoughts and the terrible weight of waiting. Robert did not come to her chambers that night, nor the next morning, nor the day after that. Seraphina remained in the East Wing, existing in a strange limbo where she was neither fully Duchess nor completely expelled. Servants brought meals she could not eat. Lady Margaret visited daily with gentle conversation that carefully avoided any mention of the scandal or Robert's state of mind. The dowager sent word that the newspapers were indeed feasting on the story, with headlines ranging from the scullery-maid Duchess to aristocratic deception exposed. Political cartoons depicted Robert as a lovesick fool being led by the nose by a scheming fortune hunter. Two of his closest allies in Parliament had already publicly distanced themselves from association with him. The damage was exactly as catastrophic as predicted. On the third day, a footman arrived with a message that His Grace requested her presence in the library at 8 o'clock that evening. Seraphina spent the intervening hours in a state of numb anticipation, knowing that this meeting would determine the entire trajectory of her future. She dressed carefully in a simple day gown, eschewing any jewels or obvious displays of wealth. She would not face judgment draped in the spoils of her deception. At precisely 8 o'clock, she descended the stairs and walked to the library, each step feeling like a march toward execution. Robert was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her, his posture rigid with contained emotion. The room smelled of leather and old books and the brandy he had clearly been drinking. He did not turn when he spoke. I have spent the past 3 days attempting to understand how I could have been so thoroughly deceived. I have replayed every conversation we ever had, searching for clues I should have noticed. I have examined my own judgment and found it catastrophically flawed. I have listened to my solicitors explain the various legal options available to me: annulment, prosecution for fraud, civil suits to recover any funds you may have spent. I have heard from former friends who are gleefully distancing themselves, and from political enemies who see this scandal as an opportunity to destroy what remains of my influence. I have considered every possible response to this situation, and I find myself arriving always at the same question: who were you when you told me you loved me? Seraphina swallowed against the tightness in her throat. I was exactly who you saw, Robert. That, at least, was never false. The woman who discussed philosophy with you, who laughed at your dry humor, who fell in love with your kindness and intelligence, she was real. Seraphina Blackwood loved you just as desperately as Mrs. Helena Ashford claimed to. The only lie was my name and my history. Everything else, every emotion, every moment of connection, was genuine. He finally turned to face her, and she was shocked by how much older he looked, as though the past 3 days had aged him a decade. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, his face drawn with pain and exhaustion. How am I meant to believe that? How am I meant to trust any profession of love from someone who has proven herself capable of systematic, sustained deception? It was the question she had been asking herself, and she had no good answer beyond the inadequate truth. You cannot, I suppose. Trust, once broken, cannot be commanded back into existence through words alone. I can only tell you that I never intended to fall in love with you. I never planned to marry you. When I accepted that stolen invitation, I was simply trying to survive, to create a life marginally better than slow starvation in Parisian slums. Meeting you was an accident. Loving you was inevitable. And marrying you was the most selfish thing I have ever done, because I knew, that eventually the truth would emerge and destroy us both. But I could not bring myself to walk away from the only genuine happiness I had ever known. So yes, I am guilty. Guilty of deception, of fraud, of reaching far above my station and dragging you down in the process. I do not ask for forgiveness because I do not deserve it. I ask only that you believe that my love for you was real, even when everything else was false. Robert walked to his desk and retrieved a leather folder, which he placed on the table between them. These are annulment papers. My solicitors assure me that given the fraudulent nature of our marriage, dissolution should be straightforward. You would relinquish all claims to the Hartwell name and fortune. In exchange, I would not pursue criminal prosecution. My mother has arranged for a settlement that would allow you to live comfortably but quietly, somewhere far from London. Lady Margaret has contacts in America who might provide opportunities for a fresh start under yet another assumed name. This is the rational solution, the one that minimizes further damage and allows both of us to move forward with our lives separate from this catastrophe. Seraphina stared at the folder, feeling the weight of finality pressing down. This was it, then. The end of her impossible dream. She would return to being nobody, albeit a slightly wealthier nobody than before. She would disappear into anonymity while Robert rebuilt his reputation through time and strategic rehabilitation. It was the only sensible outcome. So why was her hand not reaching for the papers? Why was every fiber of her being screaming in protest against this tidy resolution? Robert continued, his voice rough with suppressed emotion, but there is another option. One that my solicitors strenuously advised against. One that will cost me everything I have worked to build politically and socially. One that will make us both objects of ridicule and pity for years to come. He moved around the desk until he stood directly before her, close enough that she could see the exact silver-gray shade of his eyes, the fine lines that creased the corners when he smiled, though he was not smiling now. We could remain married. We could face this scandal together. We could use my platform, diminished though it may be, to advocate for exactly the kind of social reforms that would make it less necessary for brilliant, capable women like yourself to resort to deception simply to survive. We could transform our private catastrophe into public purpose. It would not be easy. Society would ostracize us. My political career in its current form would be finished. We would have to build an entirely new life from the ashes of the old one. But we would build it together, on a foundation of truth rather than lies. Seraphina felt hope flare in her chest, dangerous and impossible. Robert, you cannot mean this. You would sacrifice everything, your reputation, your political future, your standing in society, for someone who systematically deceived you. He reached for her hands, and this time she did not pull away. I have spent 3 days in agony, Seraphina. Not because you lied about your name or your past, but because I thought I had lost you. I thought the woman I fell in love with did not exist, that she was merely a fiction you had created to manipulate me. But I realized something crucial, the woman I love does exist. She exists in every charitable act you have performed, every genuine laugh we have shared, every moment of intellectual connection. She exists in the way you treat servants with respect, in the school you built for children who have nothing, in the fierce determination I see in your eyes even now when you think all is lost. He pulled her closer, and she felt tears finally break free, streaming down her face unchecked. You asked how I can trust you again. The answer is, slowly, carefully, with both of us fully aware of how fragile trust is and how much work it requires to maintain. But I am willing to do that work, Seraphina, if you are. I am willing to build something real from the ruins of what we thought we had. The question is, are you brave enough to stay? To face the consequences of your deceptions rather than running back into comfortable anonymity? Are you willing to become the Duchess you pretended to be, not by birth or by fraud, but by choosing every day to be worthy of the position? Seraphina looked into his face and saw not anger or betrayal, but something far more terrifying and precious: hope. Hope that love might somehow survive the weight of lies. Hope that two people from impossibly different worlds might forge something genuine from the wreckage of deception. "I am terrified," she whispered. "Terrified of failing you again, of disappointing you, of proving inadequate to the trust you are offering." Robert smiled then, sad and small but real. "Good. Fear means you understand the stakes. Now answer the question, are you staying or leaving?" And Seraphina, who had spent her entire life running from one disaster to the next, made the hardest choice of all. She stayed. The scandal did not fade quickly, but it did eventually transform from fresh outrage into historical curiosity. The weeks immediately following Seraphina's exposure were brutal beyond anything she had imagined. Invitations ceased entirely. Former friends cut her dead in the street. Satirical poems about the scullery-maid Duchess circulated in gentlemen's clubs. Robert's remaining political allies abandoned him one by one, unable to weather association with such public embarrassment. The household staff, caught between loyalty to the family and societal pressure, became divided in their allegiances. Some left, unable to serve a woman they now viewed as an imposter. Others stayed, often the ones who had come from humble origins themselves and saw in Seraphina's story echoes of their own struggles. But something unexpected began to happen as the scandal penetrated beyond aristocratic circles. The working classes, who had always viewed the nobility with mixture of envy and resentment, found in Seraphina's story a kind of folk hero narrative. Here was proof that birth did not determine worth, that intelligence and determination could sometimes triumph over the rigid hierarchies that kept most people trapped in the circumstances of their birth. Letters began arriving at Hartwell, dozens, then hundreds, from shop girls and factory workers, from governesses and washerwomen, thanking her for proving that class barriers were not insurmountable. These women saw past the scandal to the courage it required to even attempt such a transformation. They did not care that she had lied about her origins, they cared that she had dared to dream beyond them. Robert, stripped of his political ambitions and social standing, discovered something unexpected: freedom. Without the constant pressure to maintain aristocratic appearances, he could finally pursue the reforms he had always believed in but had been too cautious to champion openly. Together, he and Seraphina established a foundation dedicated to educating poor children, particularly girls who showed academic promise but lacked resources to develop it. They opened their estate for a new kind of social gathering, not glittering balls for the elite, but practical workshops teaching working women skills that might elevate their economic prospects. The remaining aristocrats who still socialized with them did so quietly, privately, unwilling to publicly associate with scandal but unable to deny the genuine good the Hartwell Foundation was accomplishing. The Dowager, true to her word, supported their endeavors without interference, her own grief over Arabella's death gradually transforming into purpose as she threw herself into charitable work alongside her son and daughter-in-law. The true test came 18 months after the scandal, when Seraphina gave birth to their first child. She had been terrified throughout the pregnancy, convinced that society would reject an heir born to a scullery maid. But when Lady Eleanor Grenville, named for the sister Seraphina had lost, entered the world on a crisp autumn morning, she did so surrounded by love rather than judgment. Robert held his daughter with such tender awe that Seraphina finally understood they had created something more valuable than title or reputation, a family built on honesty and chosen commitment. Lady Margaret, who had stood by them through the worst of the scandal, became Eleanor's godmother. And even the Dowager wept when she first held her granddaughter, this child who represented hope for a future less constrained by the suffocating rules that had destroyed Arabella. Society never fully forgave them, but society's opinion gradually mattered less. The Hartwell name, once synonymous with political influence and aristocratic prestige, became instead associated with social reform and progressive education. Robert lost his seat in Parliament but gained something far more valuable, a reputation as a man of principle who had chosen love and justice over empty propriety. Seraphina never stopped being aware of the whispers that followed her at the rare social events they attended, never stopped feeling the weight of aristocratic judgment. But she also never stopped being grateful for the opportunity to use her position, however controversial, to create real change for women trapped in the same circumstances she had escaped. Years later, when historians chronicled the gradual shifts in Victorian social attitudes, they would point to the Duchess of Hartwell as a pivotal if polarizing figure. The evening of Eleanor's first birthday, Seraphina stood at the window of the nursery watching the sun set over Hartwell's grounds. Robert came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar ritual. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying, I mean." fighting through the scandal rather than accepting that quiet American exile. She leaned back against him, watching their daughter sleep peacefully in her cradle, surrounded by toys and love and possibilities her mother had never known. Every day I am terrified that I am not enough, that my past will somehow taint her future, that the lies I told will echo down through generations. But regret? No. I regret the deception, the necessity that drove me to it, the pain I caused you. But I do not regret the choice to stay and build something real from the wreckage. Robert turned her in his arms so they faced each other, his expression serious but warm. You know, when I first fell in love with you, I thought I was falling for Mrs. Helena Ashford, the mysterious widow with impeccable manners and cultivated grace. It took me far too long to understand that I actually fell in love with Seraphina Blackwood, the survivor, the fighter, the woman who refused to let birth circumstances define her limitations. That woman was always there, beneath the borrowed name and fabricated history. She is the woman I chose to build a life with, and she is extraordinary not despite her origins but because of them. His words still had the power to undo her careful composure, and she felt tears prick at her eyes despite her best efforts to maintain dignity. She thought of the girl she had been, standing on Dover docks with 3 shillings and impossible dreams. That girl would never have imagined this future, not the Duchess title, but this, a husband who knew all her secrets and loved her anyway, a daughter who would grow up free from the shame and desperation that had defined her own childhood, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival into genuine meaning. She had traveled Europe as Mrs. Nobody, invisible and anonymous. She had become the most hated Duchess in England, vilified and judged. But in the end, she had become something more important than either of those identities. She had become herself, Seraphina Blackwood Grenville, complicated and flawed, loved and useful, worthy not because of her title but because of what she chose to do with the platform it provided. Robert kissed her forehead gently, then moved to check on their sleeping daughter. Seraphina watched him adjust Eleanor's blanket with such tender care and felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. They had lost much in the scandal's aftermath: prestige, political power, social acceptance. But they had gained something infinitely more valuable: authenticity. Their marriage was built now on truth rather than deception, on chosen commitment rather than convenient circumstance. It was harder, certainly. There were still nights when Seraphina woke gasping from nightmares about being exposed, about losing everything again. There were still moments when Robert's face would shadow with remembered betrayal. But they had faced the worst truth and survived it together. And that, she thought, was what real love actually looked like, not the romantic delusion of Lake Como, but this, 2 imperfect people choosing each other repeatedly, consciously, despite full knowledge of each other's flaws and failures. Eleanor stirred in her sleep, making soft baby sounds that pulled both her parents to her cradle. They stood together, watching the rise and fall of her tiny chest, and Seraphina understood with crystal clarity what mattered most. This child would grow up in a world slightly more forgiving than the one Seraphina had been born into, partly because of the work her parents were doing to change it. Eleanor would know her mother's true history. There would be no lies, no shameful secrets eating away at the foundation of their family. She would understand that worth was earned through character and actions, not inherited through bloodlines. And perhaps, when she was old enough to understand, she would appreciate that her mother had fought for her before she was even born, had risked everything to create a future where daughters of scullery maids might have choices beyond servitude or deception. The scandal that had nearly destroyed them had instead refined them, burning away the pretenses and leaving only what was essential and true. Seraphina would always be controversial, would always carry the stain of her deceptions and her origins. But she would also always be honest now, would always choose truth even when lies were more comfortable. She had traveled Europe as Mrs. Nobody and become the most hated Duchess in England. But more importantly, she had survived, had loved, had used her unlikely position to create genuine change. She had become precisely what she had always needed: someone who refused to accept that circumstances of birth determined destiny. And standing in that nursery with her husband and daughter, she finally understood that redemption was not about erasing past mistakes but about transforming them into future purpose. She had stolen a life she was not born to, but she had earned the right to keep it through every choice she made afterward. And that, she thought as Eleanor's tiny hand closed around her finger, was a story worth telling, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that sometimes, love and courage could indeed triumph over the rigid hierarchies designed to keep people in their assigned places. She had been nobody. She had been hated. But in the end, she had become exactly who she needed to be, herself, entirely and unapologetically, with all the messy, complicated truth of her journey written across every choice she would continue to make. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Duke's shadow. This tale of courage, deception, and ultimate redemption reminds us that our worth is not determined by the circumstances of our birth, but by the choices we make when faced with impossible situations. If this story moved you, please share it with others who might need to hear that transformation is possible, that love can survive truth, and that second chances, earned through honesty and work, are sometimes the most precious gifts of all. Subscribe to our channel for more Victorian romance stories that explore the complex territories of the heart. Leave a comment telling us what you thought of Seraphina and Robert's journey. We read every single one. Until our next story, may you always have the courage to choose truth over comfortable lies, and may you find people who love you not despite your flaws, but with full knowledge of them.